Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Today we're picking up where we left off last week regarding a creature in Alaska with an incredibly deadly reputation. A creature known to be so strong, it could kill and carry away a moose with its bare hands, able to kill an entire group of experienced hunters who were unfortunate enough to be caught in its territory, and quite possibly be the reason for an entire town's population to evacuate the area out of fear. Yes, today we are picking up where we left off in discussing the Nantinak and its involvement in the abandonment of Port Chatham. There have been an incredible number of horrifying stories of this creature's deadly influence over the population back in the early 20th century, but could these stories and encounters be actually true? That's what the aim will be in this second part of this topic, to decide whether or not these claims of a Bigfoot-like creature is actually to blame for the evacuation, or if these claims are much more grounded in our known reality of the world. But first, last episode I ended up saying I had a few more stories to share, so let's begin. Since its abandonment 70 years ago, the ghost town of Port Chatham has been invaded by wildlife. Trees, grass, and animals have all replaced what was once a small fishing and logging town. Those on the more superstitious side tend to avoid traveling in the area, and for good reason. There are still those who believe the dreaded Nantinak still roams and guards the area. And now Port Chatham only plays host to animals who have moved in and made it their home, and the occasional hunter passing by the area. In this short story I'm about to share, it involves one of these hunters who were careless enough to have entered the area, ignoring the warnings from the local indigenous population. In 1968, a hunter who had heard the stories before of the dangerous guardian stalking the woods outside of the abandoned ghost town of Port Chatham didn't believe the stories that a large, wild, hairy man-like creature stalked the woods surrounding the area. Knowing the legend kept many other hunters away, he eagerly traveled to the area, hoping to beg one of the many goats who populated the mountains and rocky cliffs just beyond where the old town sat. As he traveled among the pines, brushing his hands along the rough bark and sharp needles, he approached the location to which he believed would serve him best for finding his prey. He noticed the forest had been eerily quiet as he reached the edge of the tree line to face the rocky side of a high cliff. He crouched down, trying to find and listen for any signs of mountain goat activity nearby. But as he explained, the only noise he picked up was the moving of branches and crunching of leaves behind him, back in the trees. As he turned around to look, hoping a bear hadn't been approaching him, he was stunned to see the angry face of a 10-foot-tall, hairy man walking on two large, bare feet directly towards him. Now realizing what he had been warned about for so many years was coming face to face with him, he knew the stories to be true, and what would happen if this creature got a hold of him. The hunter, not even picking up his backpack off the ground, began sprinting down the tree line with the creature hot on his heels, beginning a chase that would last for hours. With pure adrenaline and without his heavy backpack to weigh him down, the hunter managed to expand the gap between him and this beast chasing him down the mountain. From what he claims, he was able to stay far enough ahead of the creature that when he managed to find his way to the old dilapidated town of Port Chatham, he was able to duck into one of the old rundown buildings to hide in. According to him, he was stuck inside one of the old houses for hours, and he listened intently on the noises of the hairy creature outside wandering around searching for him. Eventually, after a long wait, the hunter, figuring it was safe enough to venture from his hiding spot after not hearing the creature for a while, emerged from the home he was hiding in and made the long trek back to his truck, defeated after a long day of becoming the hunted. Even more recent, in 1990, an Anchorage paramedic who was dispatched to treat an Aleut Native man in his 70s who suffered a heart attack at the Eagle River Jail shares the story he had with the old man about the Nantinak. En route to the hospital, I had time to talk with this gentleman who was an Aleut from the native village of Port Graham, a remote village on the lower end of Cook Inlet. Well, as usual with me, the topic eventually drifted to hunting and fishing, and I casually mentioned to him that I and 2 other hunter buddies were once weathered up at the upper lagoon of Dogfish Bay, only a few miles from his home in Port Graham. The lagoon was about as beautiful and wild a place I have ever seen in my 35 years in Alaska. Well, when I said that I had spent some time in Dogfish, this old man sat up on the gurney and grabbed me by the front of my shirt. He got right up to my face and asked, "Did it bother you?" Well, with that question, the hair just stood on the back of my head. I told him, yes, it had. "Did you see it?" was his next question. And I said, "No, did you see it?" He exclaimed, "No, but my brother had seen it. It chased him." This old Aleut and I were talking about the same thing, but we never used the word Bigfoot or legend or anything like that. But we both knew what we were talking about. You see, in August of 1973, 3 of us were bow hunting for goats and black bears in what was then the remote wilderness of Lower Cook Inlet, when a storm forced us to take shelter in Dogfish Bay Lagoon. We beached our skiff and let the tide run her dry. After a dinner of broiled salmon, we turned into our tent. Back in those days, the best tent we had was a dark green canvas job with a center pole and no windows or floor. We left the fire burning and cleaned the pots and pans so as not to attract bears during the night, and turned in. The sky was clear, but the wind was howling through the old growth timber that lined the shore. And sometime around 2 a.m., my friend Dennis woke me up by squeezing my leg. I could dimly see his face in the tent. His finger was across his lips. I listened, and then I heard it. A step. A man was quietly walking outside our tent, taking very deliberate steps. Not a bear. Scenes from the movie Deliverance flashed through my mind. We woke Joe, the 3rd member of our party, with the same leg grab and finger to the lips. The walking, or rather the sneaking, continued until it half circled our tent, and then all was quiet, except for the wind. We had our bows in the 06 leaning against a tree outside of the tent, so somehow we talked Joe into belly crawling out of the tent to get the rifle. We were scared shitless, I tell you. The next day and night, the storm continued to blow. We saw several black bears on the salmon stream at the head of the lagoon during the evening hunt, but had no chance for a shot. We didn't talk about what happened last night, too embarrassed, I guess, to be scared of a black bear that sounded like a man. We got back to camp early and built a big fire. We sat around it and ate dinner until around midnight. In August, there was still some light in the sky until around 10 or 11, and I recall that we were all embarrassed about being afraid of the coming night. We had a flashlight and the rifle in the tent between us, locked and loaded. I finally dozed off, but woke right up when Dennis squeezed my leg again. The illuminated hands of my watch showed it was 2:30. Joe was already sitting up and had the rifle in hand. I heard the first step, not more than about 10 feet from the back of the tent. Slowly, then another and another. Whatever this was, it sounded like it was walking on 2 feet. It made the same semicircle around the tent. When we finally got enough courage to crawl out of the tent and turn the flashlight on, we saw nothing. No tracks or anything. The 3rd night, we decided if it bothered us again, we would come out of the tent shooting. We were actually scared. It never came back the 3rd night, and the following day we had a break in the weather and got the heck out of there. This last story I'll share here doesn't take place after the abandonment of Port Chatham, but rather many years before, in 1900, when prospectors littered the mountains and valleys of the state, searching for valuable veins of gold. Now, this story takes us over to Thomas Bay near the border of Alaska and British Columbia, which rests a few hundred kilometers away from Port Chatham, but still grants us a look into the mysterious wildlife yet to be documented. This area, known to rest a short distance away from a mountain known as the Devil's Thumb, is also known to be cursed land, one full of monsters, devils, and death. For an example, back in 1750, an entire village of 500 Alaskan natives were completely wiped out from Thomas Bay after an incredibly large landslide took the whole village out in a single night, causing many people to believe the bay itself is haunted. But as for devils, I'll let you, the listener, decide if the rumors are true or not. Harry Culp, one of the prospectors in his party of 4, tells his story of when one of his fellow prospectors ran into what would become one of Alaska's more famous urban legends in the area, and shared with him the story of how he was nearly captured by the beasts who roam there. In spring of 1900, found 4 men batching together in a shack at Wrangell, Alaska. All 4 were broke, as is usual with prospectors. As luck would have it, I was one of the 4. For reasons which would become quite obvious, I will just call the other 3 John, Charlie, and Fred. Charlie came into the shack one night in April, all excited, and said, "Fellas, I've been on a trail of an old Indian for the last month, trying to get him to tell me where he picked up a piece of free gold quartz he has at his camp. I never said anything about it before because I wanted to get the story from him first, and today he spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, then turn to the high mountains, and after traveling about 1.5 miles, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. Well, of course, as a prospector is ready to stampede on a whisper of gold any place, and we are no exceptions to the rule, we all talked the matter over, and finally it was decided that we would run our faces for an outfit, and send Charlie to look the prospect over. While he was gone, John, Fred, and myself would hustle work somewhere for another grub stake and to pay the old one off. The forepart of May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and, having favorable weather, left Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies northwesternly about 50 miles. He had 3 months of supplies, but was to come back anytime sooner if he found anything. But if he didn't show up at that time, we were to put on a search for him. John and Fred took a contract to get out wood, and I got a job in Wrangell sawmill. Things went along until the first part of June, when, on a Sunday in the late afternoon, we all being home, and in walks Charlie without a coat or hat and looking as if he had just been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatsoever, just heaved a piece of quartz over onto a corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in and want to rest." The fellow looked at it, and after he had eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. We picked up the piece of quartz and say, boy, it sure was a pretty thing to look at for a prospector. It was shot through with gold specks just like a badly freckled-faced kid. Were we excited? I'll say we were. Just before dark, we walked down to the beach to bring Charlie's outfit, as he had come up to the shack with only that piece of quartz in his hand, but there wasn't a thing in the canoe, except the oars. Not much sleep for us that night, but Charlie never stopped sawing wood. We had hard work getting Charlie up for breakfast the next morning, but when he did roll out, he just ate, borrowed a coat and hat, and left the house without saying a word or even answering one of our questions out of the many put to him by us. All of us, being excited and feeling ourselves worth a fortune, did not go to work that day, but sat around the shack and passed that blamed piece of rock back and forth to each other while we talked and waited for Charlie to come back and make his report. And believe me, we were anxious to hear it. Along in the afternoon he came in and said, "Fellas, the SS Drigo will be in on her way south early tomorrow morning. Can you give me enough money for my ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found the quartz, but my advice to you is to forget about it. It will never do you any good and will only cause you a lot of mental and physical pain. If we were not partners, I would never open my lips about this trip or what I found. But if you promise never to mention my name in connection with what I tell you, or mention the name of Thomas Bay to me again, I'll give you the straight of my experience up there. Judge for yourselves as to my saneness, because this is the most astounding thing you ever heard, and as far as I'm concerned, is beyond me to reason it out. Don't ask any questions to prolong my story any longer than it takes to tell it, as I want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. I will try to make the one telling plain enough. The first night after leaving Wrangell, I found me an ideal cove. Next night I reached Muddy River in time to make camp again. The third night I hit Ruth Island and Thomas Bay. I spent the next day looking up Patterson River for a suitable place for a good camp, which I found 1/4 of a mile up the tidewater on the right-hand side, looking up the river. Broke camp on Ruth Island the next day and moved up to the place I picked out the day before. Put up my tent, packed up my outfit, and left the canoe on the riverbank. The next day I spent cooking beans, cutting wood, and making things comfortable for a long stay. As it looked like rain, I wanted to get things fixed to keep dry. It started to rain that night and just kept up for days. I lost track of time, as each day was just like the one before. I had nothing to read, was all alone, and couldn't do anything without getting soaked, and the roar of the river and wind through the timber just drove me bugs, so I put in most of my time sleeping. Finally, the weather broke and I got out. Spent several days in trying to find the old Indian's Half Moon Lake, but I couldn't get it spotted. I did find, about 2 miles from camp up the river and about a mile from it, a lake shaped like the letter S. On the creek coming out from the lower end, I panned some pretty good colors, but, as I figured, not enough to get excited about. Yet, an indication of gold in the country. Talk about a dead country, that sure is. There doesn't seem to be any life in there at all. You might spend all day in the timber without seeing a squirrel. I was getting sort of tired of the beans and rice and bacon, so I made up my mind I would go over to a ridge about 8 miles east of the S Lake and get a few grouse, as I thought I could hear a few hooters up there when I was at the head of this lake. I left come the next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I took only the rifle with me, and when I came up to the ridge, sure enough, there were a few grouse hooting. I shot 2 and had gotten them when I bagged another one, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before it hung up. While on my way down to pick it up, I found that piece of quartz. Up to that time, I had paid very little attention to what the country I was in looked like, as it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show up, and I had no tools with me to uncover it. The top of the old snag had broken off and fallen, scraping the top moss and loose dirt for a space of about 8 feet wide and 18 or 20 feet long, uncovering this quartz ledge, which is where I found this piece. This ledge was worked smooth by a glacier at one time. I couldn't find anything to break a piece off with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that piece. In doing so, I broke the stock of my gun, thus ruining it for further use. This didn't worry me as any, as I knew there was not game in this country larger than a grouse, and damned few of them. My first thought was the richness of the quartz, and of you fellas, and getting back to town to round you all up, so we could get busy on it. After looking over and enjoying the feeling of knowing I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge up again with moss, limbs, and rotten chunk. Finishing that job, I thought I would climb the ridge directly over the ledge and get my landmarks, so I could come back to it again or tell you where it was if anything should happen to me. This I did, climbing straight up over the ledge of the ridge till I reached the top, which was about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. I looked down below me and picked out a big tree with a bushy top, taller than the rest and about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of this tree from where I stood, I could see out on Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, the point of Vanderput Spit, and turning a little to the left I could see Sequoia Island from the mouth of Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with that, I turned half round to get a backside on some mountain peaks, and lying below me on the other side of the ridge from the ledge was the Half Moon Lake the Indian had told me about. Right there, fellas, I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I never see or go through the lacks of it again. Swarming up the ridge towards me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, with their bodies covered with long coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from the sores of their bodies made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first one, and then I threw it at them and turned and ran. God, how I did run. I could feel their hot breath on my back. Their long claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smells from their streaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, and while the noises they made, yelling, screaming, and breathing, drove me mad, reason left me. How I reached the canoe or how I hung on to that piece of quartz is a mystery to me. When I came to, it was night, and I was lying on the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Sequoia Island, cold, hungry, and crazy for a drink of water. But only to satisfy the latter urge, I started for Wrangell, and here I am. You no doubt think I'm either crazy or lying. All I can say is, there's the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away tomorrow on that boat. And with that, so passed out Charlie from our lives. we put his story down as a fantasy caused by loneliness and morbid thought. Alaska, as I've constantly stressed in the past 2 episodes, is a completely wild frontier. The majority of the state remains untouched and unexplored by humans, causing one to never fully know what's living out there. If there are in fact monsters or devils roaming those mountains and forests, only a few brave explorers would ever truly know what goes on out there. In regards to the case of the dreaded Nantinak and the abandonment of Port Chatham, could there really have been an apex predator who caused the entire town's occupants to flee the town in terror? Or perhaps the abandonment was under more explainable circumstances? As all the stories I've told over the past 2 episodes rely simply on believing the words of those who claim they have seen or experienced encounters with the Nantinak, it has caused more than a few skeptical people to question the authenticity of these stories. A quick look into the program called Alaska's Digital Newspaper, which has provided the Library of Congress over 250,000 pages of news coming out of this state since the 1700s up until 1963, neglects to make any mention of the violent killings around Port Chatham that we have heard in the stories. In fact, in the couple hundred of news articles searched with the key words of both Portlock and Port Chatham, offer up few entries any more interesting than the production of the 3 main exports: fishing, logging, and mining. And considering at the time these 3 occupations were among some of the more dangerous professions, there had only been 1 mention of a single death that had happened. In what had been labeled an accident, the death occurred in 1920 due to the harsh conditions these frontiermen endured while completing their work. What's most surprising to me, though, is only 1 death had been reported. The dangers involved with these 3 jobs surely could have produced more deaths throughout the years. But I'm not saying I'm not happy there was such a small number of deaths, but if the stories of the Nantinak were true in this area, surely something as terrifying and violent as the deaths were in their respective stories would have made it onto the newspapers at the time. Now, what if we think of murders? If there are so many stories of people dying over the course of several decades, there must have been a reason for these rumors to pop up. Well, unless there had been a serial killer on the loose that continued to go undiscovered for decades with no reports on missing people or violent killings, I believe we can safely assume the Port Chatham area was relatively crime-free aside from a few small mundane offenses. Now, as for missing persons go, I mentioned in the opening of the first episode, Alaska has always had a large number of people going missing in those forests ever since people had first settled there. It's hardly surprising if 1 or 2 people go missing after becoming lost in the woods after venturing into it. But even then, there wasn't really any mention of reports of a large number of people going missing in the area of Port Chatham over the course of the years the Nantinak was supposedly to have been hunting humans. But for the biggest note of people going missing and never being found again comes from 2 hunters who had traveled by boat through the gulfs and inlets of the state. And people running into trouble sailing on water is definitely not anything new or mysterious for the time. So, we're now faced with a big question. If the stories of a giant hairy creature killing, kidnapping, hunting people around Port Chatham are little more than just works of the imagination, what really caused the residents of Port Chatham to leave the town itself and to become desolate? Well, that reason might be a bit more easily explained than most would think. Now yes, the town's industry was alive and well operating, causing many to wonder why people would leave this prosperous town. Perhaps this is what caused the explanation for the Nantinak forcing everyone out. But in reality, what some people believe to happen overnight, the occupants actually slowly trickled out of town over the course of a few years before its complete abandonment in 1951. It wasn't due to a bloodthirsty beast in the woods outside of town, but something happening quite a distance away from the town itself. The Alaska Route 1 highway was fully completed in its construction in the 1940s, just a couple years earlier when the first resident from Port Chatham left for greener pastures. With the new highway connecting hundreds of small towns and cities to the state capital of Anchorage, allowing supplies, resources, and industry to easier access and transport their goods via driving, rather than the more expensive and time-consuming process of shipping goods out of the inlets and peninsulas, it seemed like the obvious choice. Many of the small towns dotting the coastlines, who were otherwise inaccessible other than that of ships and boats, began losing their populations as people realized living in these places were no longer viable. Industries in these towns would then move their business to a town or city where they would both have access to the highway and would allow them to grow and prosper along the way. And as fate would have it, Port Chatham just so happened to be one of these small towns who happened to live far away from the newly constructed highway. As more and more towns emptied out and their residents moved away for easier access to the amenities of modern life, the residents of Port Chatham hopped on the migration wagon and moved away. Not because of a deadly forest creature, but for an easier life. The stories surrounding the small town of Port Chatham are ones that have been around for a very long time, and although the residents of the town most likely hadn't fled the area because of a rampaging Bigfoot, but rather for easier and more productive lives, the legend of the Nantinak is very much an entertaining tale. Alaska is a large area of unexplored and undiscovered wilderness, so while yes, the Port Chatham incident may have been untrue, we don't truly know for sure if creatures like the Nantinak are really out there or not. Even in the last story involving Charlie's encounter at Moon Lake with the half-man, half-ape creatures way back in the 1900s, there could be something to the idea of undiscovered creatures roaming those woods. I had done an episode a few months back about the Satagen, which was a large, unknown hairy creature who had been seen and encountered in the Canadian territory of the Yukon, just next door to Alaska. So who knows for sure if there really aren't creatures out there we have yet to discover. As most stories tell, however, these creatures who are rarely encountered by humans are often portrayed as territorial, aggressive, and dangerous, and are probably best just left alone. As unofficial guardians of the untouched forests in our world, perhaps it's best they stay in those woods, keeping the natural order in check, and making sure us humans don't destroy even more of their habitat than we already have. Thank you all for listening to my mini-series about the Port Chatham abandonment and the Nantinak who haunts the area. And even though I came to the conclusion of it being false, I don't want to discourage anyone into investigating the unknown. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the past 2 episodes. And if you did, give the podcast a 5-star review on iTunes and share it with your friends and family who you think might be interested in hearing the history of this small town. If you would like, give me a follow on Instagram at Moonlightlorepodcast and on Twitter at LoreMoonlight. Also, if you have any questions, suggestions, or a paranormal experience of your own, feel free to email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, keep your lanterns lit and keep exploring the unknown.